The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song above the ICU at Sacred Heart, that peculiar hum that exists at the frequency of exhaustion. Hannah Clarke moved through the unit like someone who understood the mathematics of invisibility, 5 feet 2 inches, dark hair pulled back, scrubs that fit like they belonged to someone else, hands that never trembled. She had learned long ago that visibility got you killed. Anonymity kept you alive. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. The monitors beeped in their synchronized chorus. And Hannah moved between them with the kind of surgical precision that made placing an IV in a rolling vein look like an afterthought rather than an art form. But nobody noticed. They were too busy talking. The tall nurses clustered at the station, Sarah with her voice that carried 3 rooms down, Jackson with his laugh that made people look up, Martinez with her way of making rounds sound like celebrations instead of ward management. They were the kind of nurses who filled space, who made themselves impossible to ignore. They were the kind of nurses who looked the part. Hannah was the kind who just did the work. Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, and the air pressure in the ICU changed the moment his Italian shoes hit the linoleum. He was 48, built like a man who spent mornings at a gym where people knew his name, with a kind of jawline that could cut glass and eyes that tracked weakness the way a tiger tracks blood in water. He was the new chief of medicine, brought in after the previous administration had imploded under the weight of its own scandals, a billing fraud investigation, a sexual harassment settlement, 3 department heads suddenly retired. Sterling was here to establish order. Sterling was here to establish dominance. Sterling was here to prove that the hospital's hierarchy began and ended with him. He watched Hannah in the break room on Thursday during her lunch shift. She sat alone at the corner table, a container of something she'd brought from home, and the moment she opened it, 3 conversations died. The other nurses gathered their food and migrated toward the hallway with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they'd practiced it. Within 30 seconds, Hannah was eating in the kind of silence that felt manufactured, artificial, like the absence of noise had weight and texture. Sterling smiled. He understood power dynamics. He understood how to isolate prey. What he didn't understand was that Hannah had eaten alone in war zones. This was nothing. This was a luxury. He began his campaign on Friday morning, running rounds with the precision of a man performing for an audience. He questioned every medication timing, every nursing note, every decision made in the hours before his arrival. His voice carried the particular texture of condescension, that specific tone that made competence sound like incompetence, that transformed 13 years of nursing experience into some kind of cute amateur mistake. But Hannah said nothing. She stood at the back of the group, her eyes on the patient, her hand steady, and she said absolutely nothing. The other nurses watched. They always watched. Some of them had started whispering before Sterling finished his morning presentations, had begun explaining away his criticism with comments about how he'd settle in eventually, how every new chief goes through this phase. But Hannah understood something different. She understood that men like Sterling didn't settle. Men like Sterling escalated. The formal write-up appeared on the unit board Monday morning, printed on hospital letterhead and posted in the break room where everyone would see it. Failure to demonstrate team integration. A policy violation cited as occurring 6 minutes off protocol during medication administration on Thursday at 10:27 a.m. 6 minutes. The margins of human error in a unit where people managed life and death in real time, and Sterling had found a violation in 6 minutes. He dated it and signed it with a pen that must have cost more than Hannah's monthly car payment. He'd made the margins perfect. Hannah read it the same way she read everything, without expression. She stood in front of the board for approximately 40 seconds, scanning the words, noting the date, understanding the architecture of the message beneath the message. This wasn't about medication timing. This was about establishing that she was vulnerable. This was about proving that no corner of the hospital was safe from his authority. That afternoon, during the shift change, she found herself standing across the nurse's station from Dr. Sterling. He was reviewing a chart, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his movements suggesting a man completely confident in his position. The station had that particular acoustic quality where conversations carried, the kind of space where words didn't stay private. Sarah was updating the outgoing day shift. Martinez was pulling labs. Jackson was documenting something in the computer system. The room hummed with activity. Hannah met his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to see that she'd read the write-up. Just long enough for him to see that she understood what was happening. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from muscle memory, from 3 tours in places where showing fear was the fastest way to die. And a single tear traced her cheek, not from sadness, not from humiliation, but from the simple physiological reality of being human. She let it fall. She didn't hide it. She didn't wipe it away until she'd held Sterling's eyes for exactly 3 seconds longer, until she'd made sure he understood that the tear wasn't a sign of breaking. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand. "I've seen better men than you," she said quietly, her voice like someone speaking across a hospital bed to a family member, "break under a lot less pressure, doctor." She didn't raise her voice. The ICU continued its breathing around them, monitors, ventilators, the whisper of oxygen flowing through tubing. But the station had gone quiet. Sarah's hand had stopped moving. Martinez was no longer pulling labs. Jackson's fingers had stilled on the keyboard. The kind of silence that happens when someone says something they're not supposed to say, when the hierarchy gets questioned in a way that can't be ignored or explained away. Sterling's face darkened. His jaw tightened. But before he could respond, before whatever cutting remark he'd prepared could leave his mouth, a call light chimed from room 312. Then room 314. Then the monitor in room 308 began showing arrhythmia. The ICU demanded attention in that way that made all other conversations irrelevant. Hannah moved toward room 312, her composure settling over her like a familiar coat. The moment had passed. The statement had been made. She hadn't broken. That was all that mattered. She spent the next hour managing 3 patients in active decline, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from doing the same work in worse conditions. For adjustments. Medication administration. The small mathematics of keeping people alive when their bodies wanted to shut down. By 5 o'clock, the arrhythmia had resolved, both patients had stabilized, and the shift was approaching its end. It was during the evening documentation, with the ICU settling into that particular quiet that comes just after dinner service, that she found herself alone in room 312 with Mr. Kowalski. He was 62, recovering from a pneumothorax repair, his chest tube in place and draining appropriately, his oxygen saturation holding steady at 94%. He'd been requesting Hannah specifically since his admission, asking for her when other nurses came to check his vitals, waiting patiently when she was occupied with other patients. She was changing his dressing with the kind of care that bordered on ritual, her movements economical and careful, the gauze removed and replaced with fresh material, the tape applied with surgical precision. And he watched her hands. He watched the way her fingers moved. He watched the scars along her knuckles, small white lines that mapped stories nobody asked about. His voice came out like a whisper, the kind you use in hospitals when you're asking something that matters. "Camp Dwyer, 2010, he said. "You were the corpsman who did a cricothyrotomy with a ballpoint pen on Lieutenant Morrison." Hannah's hand stilled. Not much. Just a fraction of a second. Just enough to suggest that the statement had landed somewhere deep and specific. She finished taping the dressing. She stepped back from the bed. She looked at him directly for the first time, really looked at him, and understood that this moment had been inevitable. The pen was a Fisher Space pen, she said quietly. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Pressurized ballpoint. Works better than standard issue in certain conditions. He nodded. He closed his eyes. And in that moment, the entire architecture of Hannah Clarke's anonymity began to develop the first hairline fractures, the kind that would eventually become breaks, the kind that would eventually bring everything down and rebuild it into something altogether different. But she didn't know that yet. She finished her work. She left the room. She went to her locker and touched the combat boots wrapped in green fabric, the way she did at the end of every shift, and she breathed in the smell of dust and distance that still clung to them after 3 years. The ICU hummed around her. The world continued. And somewhere in room 312, a patient waited for a story to be acknowledged, for a history to be recognized, for a soldier to finally stop being invisible. The morphine drip hung steady at 2 milligrams per hour when Dr. Sterling entered room 314. Hannah's hands moved with surgical precision, checking the foresight where Mrs. Kowalski's pale fingers gripped the call button. The old woman's breathing had finally settled, chest rising and falling in the rhythm of genuine rest rather than the shallow gasping of pain. Hannah adjusted the tubing, made a note in the chart. 1 minute. 2. The room was a pocket of quiet in the ICU's controlled chaos. The door opened. Hannah didn't look up. Nurse Clarke. Dr. Sterling's voice landed like a dropped weight. Explain why this patient received pain medication 6 minutes past the scheduled administration time. Hannah's hand froze on the fall line. She turned. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway in a white coat that cost more than her monthly rent, his expression arranged in the specific architecture of someone already certain of the answer. Mrs. Kowalski's daughter sat in the visitor's chair, phone already rising to camera mode. Mrs. Kowalski was in the bathroom. Doctor. Hannah's voice came out steady. Protocol requires timeliness, or can't you tell time? The words hung in the recycled air like a smell. Hannah took one measured breath. Her jaw didn't clench. Her face didn't flush. She simply met his eyes and said, I can tell time, doctor. Clearly not well enough for critical care. He turned to Mrs. Kowalski, smile suddenly warm as a lamp. Mrs. Kowalski, how are we feeling? Any concerns about your care? The daughter kept filming. Mrs. Kowalski glanced at Hannah, then back at Dr. Sterling, and said nothing. He left. The silence he left behind was the kind that builds pressure. Hannah completed the 4 check. Documented the time. Mrs. Kowalski reached out and touched her wrist, just barely, just the fingertips, but Hannah was already moving into the hallway where the fluorescent lights hummed their endless industrial song and somewhere down the corridor a monitor beeped its rhythmic complaint. The next morning in the break room, Hannah sat with her turkey sandwich on wheat bread, the kind she made at 5:30 a.m. in her apartment's kitchenette. The sandwich was already aging into that sad state of institutional lunches. She unwrapped it anyway. 3 nurses sat at the table, Yolanda with her salad, Marcus with his pasta, Jennifer with her yogurt cup. Hannah pulled out her chair. No one looked up. Yolanda gathered her salad bowl and napkin. She didn't speak. She just migrated to the hallway, shoes squeaking against the linoleum. Marcus waited exactly 10 seconds, then followed. Jennifer stayed for 3 more seconds, long enough to make it seem like an independent decision, and then she was gone too, leaving Hannah alone at a table designed for 6. She chewed the sandwich methodically. The turkey tasted like wet cardboard. She stared at the vending machine and its rows of fluorescent-lit temptations and didn't move to buy anything. Loneliness, she'd learned in the Marines, wasn't a feeling. It was a skill. A discipline. The ability to sit in a room and exist as if you weren't there. She'd been trained for this in a different context, invisibility as survival, but the principle applied. Shoulders down. Eyes forward. Breathe on a 4 count. Don't flinch. The sandwich disappeared. She threw away the plastic wrapper. No one looked at her. On Thursday morning, when the night shift taped the performance improvement plan to the unit board, it was formatted like an institutional judgment carved in official letterhead. Nurse H. to Clarke, failure to demonstrate team integration. Performance improvement plan initiated. Dr. Sterling had typed it himself, probably. The spacing was aggressive. The font was 12-point Arial, the font of bureaucratic finality. Hannah read it while the entire day's shift pretended not to look. She could feel their eyes sliding away as she approached, the way a school of fish parts for a predator. She stood there for 9 seconds. Staring at her name typed by a man whose hands had probably never touched anything more fragile than a golf ball. Then she turned. Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station, 3 stations down, already looking at her. Waiting. His expression was the smile of someone who'd placed a trap and was watching an animal step into it. She met his eyes across the distance. One tear traced the left side of her face. She didn't touch it. Didn't blink. Just let it track down her cheek while her jaw stayed level and her shoulders stayed down. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand. Still not breaking contact. I've seen better men than you break under less pressure, doctor. Her voice came out flat. Clinical. The voice of someone reading vital signs to a recording device. His smile vanished for exactly 2 seconds. Then it returned, twice as cold, and he turned back to his charts as if she'd already stopped existing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the isolation intensified. By Monday, Hannah had stopped eating in the break room. She took her lunch outside, sat on the concrete step behind the emergency bay where the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with something chemical and wrong. A delivery truck rumbled past. She ate the sandwich alone under the Texas sun while somewhere inside, Dr. Sterling was reshaping the entire social architecture of the unit around a single principle: Hannah Clarke was radioactive. On Tuesday at 2 a.m., screaming erupted from room 308. The sound came in waves, male, rage-fueled, a voice pushed so hard it cracked at the edges. Hannah was at the supply cart restocking syringes when the first scream hit. She knew that frequency. That escalation pattern. The sound of someone whose brain chemistry had crossed a threshold it couldn't return from. Government chips. They're putting chips in her for. I can feel them moving. A woman's voice joined in, terror, not anger, and then the crash of something heavy hitting the floor. A monitor alarm. Footsteps running. The panic button being pressed. Hannah was already moving. She found room 308 in 3 seconds flat. Derek Pullman stood beside the bed waving an 8-inch kitchen knife, the blade catching the harsh overhead light like a signal. He was massive, 250 easy, maybe 260, with the specific structure of someone who'd let methamphetamine rewire his nervous system. His pupils were dilated to black discs. Neck veins bulged like blue rope under his skin. His sister, the actual patient, a 60-year-old woman 3 days post-hip surgery, screamed from the bed. Derek saw Hannah in the doorway and his entire body went rigid. Get back! His knife arm twitched upward. Hannah stepped inside. Her hands rose, palms forward, fingers spread. Every movement deliberate and open. Sir, I need you to put the knife down. You're one of them. He lunged. Her footwork was automatic. Weight shifted to her back heel. His arm passed through the space where her center had been half a second before. She pivoted, caught his knife wrist in her left hand, rotated his arm in a manner that made resistance impossible, and used his own momentum against him like a judo throw executed in a hospital room. For seconds. Derek Pullman hit the linoleum face first. Her knee was on his shoulder blade. His knife arm locked at an angle that meant struggling would break bone. Her right hand applied pressure to his cervical spine, not hard enough to damage, just hard enough to communicate the absence of options. Don't move, she said. Her voice was flat. Empty. The kind of voice that suggested no negotiation was possible. Derek didn't move. His breathing came in hot, panic bursts. The knife lay 6 feet away on the hospital-grade tile, gleaming like something that had fallen from another world. 90 seconds later, security arrived to find Hannah still holding him motionless, the patient still screaming from the bed, the sister still frozen in absolute terror. The security officers took in the scene, a small woman in scrubs with her knee on a 250-pound man's spine, no visible bruises, no blood, just the complete and utter absence of threat, and moved into a professional efficiency that bordered on choreographed. Within a minute, Houston Police Department arrived. Within 2, Derek Pullman was in handcuffs, still cursing through the fog of meth and adrenaline and the dawning realization that he'd just been taken down by someone whose weight he probably doubled. Within 5, Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with his face arranged in careful blankness. Hannah stepped back. Her hands had already returned to her sides. Her breathing had already normalized. She stood against the wall like a piece of equipment that had finished its function and was now just waiting to be stored. Dr. Sterling's eyes moved from Derek in handcuffs to the patient in the bed to Hannah in the corner to the Houston police officers documenting the scene. His jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. Then his professional mask settled back into place, and he began making notes on his phone with the precision of someone already planning his next move. The night shift would later describe what happened as a nursing assistant physically subduing a violent intruder. Nobody mentioned technique. Nobody mentioned the surgical precision of the restraint. Nobody mentioned that the small nurse in the corner had moved with the kind of economy of motion that suggested someone had taught her to hurt people, and then someone else had taught her to hurt people without causing damage. She needed to talk to the patient in room 312. The intercom crackled at 1:24 a.m. Routine. Hannah Clarke sat in the break room with cold coffee and a chart that needed reviewing, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel irrelevant. She'd been awake for 17 hours. The night shift had been quiet. Patient stable. No codes. No emergencies. Just the mechanical rhythm of 100 machines keeping people alive in the dark, and her moving between them like someone who belonged nowhere. Room 308 held Margaret Chen, admitted 3 days prior with acute pancreatitis, her pain managed, her vitals trending toward normal. Her brother Derek had arrived at visiting hours, an hour outside protocol because Mrs. Chen had asked, and Hannah had nodded and said nothing, the way she always did when people asked for things that bent the rules slightly. Derek was 42, a contractor from Port Arthur with the kind of aggressive energy that filled doorways, the kind of presence that made nurses unconsciously step back. He'd sat in the corner of his sister's room talking about money and bills and whether she'd signed the papers about the house. At 2:04 a.m., he started screaming. Not yelling. Screaming. The kind of sound that doesn't come from anger alone, the kind that comes from the brain misfiring under chemical pressure. Hannah heard it from the medication station 12 feet down the hall, and her hand stopped moving. Her body recognized the acoustic signature before her conscious mind could process it. The screaming had a shape to it. Rage. Terror. The particular pitch of someone whose chemistry had been fundamentally altered by substances and desperation. She was moving before the screaming articulated itself into words. Room 308's door was already open. Derek Pullman stood 3 feet from his sister's bed, a kitchen knife in his right hand, 8 inches, serrated edge catching the pale glow of the bedside monitor, and his face was the color of a heart attack waiting to happen. Sweat poured from his hairline. His pupils were blown wide enough to see the whites all around the iris. Methamphetamine. She recognized it the way she recognized pneumothorax or sepsis shock. The body's distress signal translated into 1,000 different dialects, and this one screamed chemical dysregulation and psychiatric break. They put chips in you, he was saying to his sister, his voice climbing into frequencies that human voices shouldn't reach. Government chips. I know about this. I read about this. They're tracking you. They're tracking everyone. Margaret Chen was pressed against the far wall of the bed, her four-pole between her and her brother like a barrier that everyone understood wouldn't hold. She was making small sounds. Not words. The sounds people make when their brain is trying to process that the person who used to take them to school had become something else entirely. Hannah stood in the doorway. Still. Assessing. Derek's arm was loose. His grip on the knife had the quality of someone who'd never held one before, who was improvising violence rather than committing it, but improvisation could still open arteries. His body language suggested he wasn't trying to kill anyone yet, he was still in the trying to convince phase. The most dangerous phase. The phase before the rage calcified into action. Derek. Hannah's voice was the temperature of an operating room. Neutral. Authoritative without volume. Put the knife down. He spun toward her. The blade caught the light and threw it across the wall like a signal. "You're one of them," he said. "I can tell. You have the look. You work for them. I'm the nurse on duty. I need you to put the knife down. They won't let me take her home. The chips won't let her leave." His arm was shaking now, the tremor of someone running on the wrong fuel at 120 beats per minute, and Hannah's mind was already calculating vectors and reaction times. Security was 3 floors down in the ground-level office. ETA for 6 minutes if they were already moving. If Delores at the desk had heard the alarm. If they'd understood what they were hearing and actually dispatched instead of checking the monitors first. She had 6 minutes. Maybe 3 if he decided Margaret's fur line needed removing with force. Hannah stepped into the room. "Derek, I need you to listen to me." He swung. It wasn't a train strike. It was the wild arc of someone whose nervous system was firing random signals, whose coordination had been shattered by whatever he'd consumed. The blade came at her from his right, high to low, the kind of swing that looked terrifying in its desperation but telegraphed its intention 3 feet before the steel arrived. Hannah's body moved like muscle memory had been waiting in the wings for 3 years, waiting for the moment when survival and instinct would override the careful anonymity she'd built. She didn't step back. She stepped in. Her left forearm came up at an angle that intercepted his wrist, not the blade. Contact with his forearm near the joint. Redirect. Redirect was all. She turned her hips 60 degrees and used his momentum, the force of his own swing, against the architecture of his own skeleton. Her right hand was under his elbow. Her body became a fulcrum. She was smaller by 70 pounds and a foot of height, but physics didn't care about fairness. Physics only cared about vectors and leverage and the fact that a 250-pound man moving forward with wild force was already committed to falling if someone simply showed him where. For seconds. That was all it took. Derek Pullman went down hard, face first against the linoleum. The knife skittered across the tile with a sound like broken glass settling. His arm was locked behind his back at an angle that suggested he could either hold still or experience pain. He made a choice. He held still. His forehead pressed against the floor, his breathing ragged and chemical sharp, and Hannah was still holding him there when the door burst open. Security arrived first. 2 officers, both trained, both professional, both moving with the kind of immediate understanding that came from seeing someone already subdued. 30 seconds behind them came Dr. Sterling. He filled the doorway like he'd been called specifically to witness something. His presence made the air pressure change. His face was the color of calculation, not shock, not outrage, but the particular expression of someone watching a carefully arranged chessboard get kicked over by an unexpected piece. "Call the police," Hannah said to the security officers. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still the temperature of an operating room. He's high on methamphetamine. Armed. He threatened the patient. The officers moved. One radioed downstairs. One began the careful process of securing Derek Pullman's hands, clicking zip tie restraints into place with the practiced efficiency of people who did this work regularly. Derek wasn't fighting anymore. The rage had burned out or transformed into something else, fear, maybe. The moment when the chemical high crashes into the awareness of consequences. Hannah released his arm and stepped back. She looked at Margaret Chen. The patient was breathing. Pale. Terrified. But intact. The four line was still functional. The cardiac monitor showed sinus rhythm, steady, regular, the visual signature of a heart still doing its work. "Margaret, you're okay," Hannah said. "I need to check your for access. Is that all right?" Margaret nodded. She was shaking, but she was nodding. Dr. Sterling hadn't moved from the doorway. His eyes were tracking Hannah's movements the way a predator tracks prey that's just shown it has teeth. She could feel his mind working. Processing. Reorganizing the architecture of what he believed about the small nurse everyone overlooked. "Dr. Clarke." His voice had a particular texture. "Where exactly did you learn to do that?" Hannah didn't look at him. She was checking Margaret's full line for infiltration, for displacement, for any sign that the violence had compromised the medical work. The tape was intact. The infusion was flowing. The small plastic catheter was still properly seated in the vein. "Self-defense class," she said. "Which one?" She straightened. She turned to look at him fully, and for the first time since he'd arrived at Sacred Heart, Dr. Sterling saw something flicker across her face. Not anger. Not fear. Something older. Something that had learned to survive in places where defense was not a class but a prerequisite. "I need to document the incident," she said. "Margaret needs to be evaluated for psychological impact. Derek needs a psychiatric hold and drug screening. Do you want me to call psychiatry, or will you?" Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. Police arrived at 2:19 a.m. 3 officers, moving with the efficiency of people who'd responded to calls like this 100 times. They took Derek Pullman. They took statements. They photographed the knife and bagged it as evidence. The night shifted back into something approaching normal, except nothing was normal anymore, and everyone in the room knew it. Hannah finished her shift. She charted everything. She wrote incident reports in the meticulous language of hospital protocol. She documented Margaret Chen's vital signs post-incident. She made notes about the intoxicated visitor and the level of threat and the response time of security. She did everything correctly. Everything by protocol. Everything that no one could possibly argue with. By 6:08 a.m., Dr. Sterling had called an emergency review board meeting for 9:41 a.m. By 6:15 a.m., he'd activated his network. She didn't know this yet, but it was happening. 2 board members from the previous administration who owed him favors for his discretion during a medication management scandal. A private investigator named Morris who'd worked hospital security cases for 15 years. A phone call to the Texas Board of Nursing. The wheels grinding into motion, the institutional machinery beginning to process her as a liability rather than an employee. She walked out of Sacred Heart at 6:22 a.m. as the city was waking up. The sun was just beginning to consider rising. The parking lot was cool and empty, and the rain from the night before had left everything slick and reflective. She'd come in at 7 p.m. the previous evening. She was leaving after the longest shift of her life. By 9:02 a.m., she was back in Dr. Sterling's office. He had the formal letter already printed. Formal letterhead. Formal language. Administrative leave, effective immediately, pending investigation into scope of practice violations and patient safety concerns related to the use of combat techniques in a hospital setting that may have endangered other patients. "I want to understand this, Nurse Clarke," he said, and his voice was the voice of someone already convinced of the conclusion. "You restrained a 250-pound man using martial arts techniques. Where did you learn those techniques?" "Self-defense class." "Which one?" "I'll need documentation." Hannah looked at the window behind his desk. The city of Houston sprawled beyond the glass, all those people in all those buildings with their private histories and their private struggles and their private ways of surviving the world. "I don't have documentation," she said. "Then how did you know how to do that?" She didn't answer. He leaned forward. "You executed a takedown maneuver on a psychiatric patient in crisis. You used physical force that could have caused serious injury. You acted without waiting for security, without following protocol, without consulting with a physician. This hospital cannot afford another scandal, Ms. Clarke. I'm sure you understand." Hannah stared at the window. "You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. A full investigation will be conducted. Your credentials will be reviewed. Your background will be audited. You'll be notified of the board's findings within 14 days. Until then, you are not to set foot on this campus. Is that understood?" She picked up the letter and read it once. Every word found its target. Every phrase was designed to make someone feel like they'd committed a crime by saving a patient's life. She set it on his desk and stood up. "I understand," she said. She walked out of his office without waiting for dismissal. Without fighting. Without explaining the training that had been muscle memory the moment Derek Pullman's arm began its arc. Without explaining that anonymity had been the most expensive thing she'd ever paid for, and she'd paid it by disappearing into work and routine and the deliberate choice to be invisible. Without explaining that the military doesn't teach you how to hurt people and then expect you to forget, no matter how hard you try, no matter how many years you spend hiding it in scrubs and compassion. On Sunday, she drove to Veterans Rest Cemetery on the east side of Houston. The rain came down like it was trying to break something open. She stood at Marcus's grave. Sergeant Marcus Clarke died 2021, beloved husband and warrior, and she was holding the pair of worn combat boots that she kept in her locker. The leather was cracked and sun-bleached. The laces were frayed from 1,000 miles of running through places where running meant staying alive. The right sole was separating at the heel from a roadside explosive device that hadn't quite killed him, but had killed something in him that wouldn't come back. She knelt in the mud, still holding the boots. "I tried to disappear like you said, Marcus," she whispered through tears. "I tried to just be Hannah the nurse. The quiet one nobody remembers. The one who doesn't matter enough to notice." The rain soaked through her jacket. Her hands were shaking now, the tremor that wasn't fear but something older, the tremor of someone holding something too heavy for too long and finally feeling the weight. "But I can't even do this right," she said to the grave. "Someone needed help and I couldn't just watch. I couldn't just call security and wait. I couldn't be invisible when someone was about to get hurt." She sat there in the mud for an hour. The cemetery was empty except for the dead and the rain. She held the boots like they were something alive, something that might answer her if she just held them long enough. But Marcus had already given her his last answer, 3 years ago, and it hadn't been enough. Dr. Sterling didn't call security. He called the board. At 2:51 a.m., while Hannah was still charting in the computer system, 3 text messages lit up his phone, messages to board members Dalton and Pierce, men who had weathered the previous administration's collapse and owed Sterling everything for staying loyal when the hospital's chief executive had gone down for prescription fraud. Within 40 minutes, Sterling had sketched the narrative. Hannah Clarke had exceeded her nursing scope, had applied military combat techniques to a civilian matter, had endangered a patient by engaging with a violent assailant instead of waiting for trained security personnel. By dawn, he had called a private investigator, a former Houston police captain named Raymond Voss with connections that ran through every government database in Texas, to audit Hannah's credentials, her certifications, her background. The investigator's retainer was $5,000. Sterling paid it in cash. The formal complaint landed on Hannah's desk at 9:15 a.m. Tuesday, printed on Texas Board of Nursing letterhead. Scope violation. Vigilante behavior. Endangerment of patients. The complaint alleged that her actions had created a hostile environment, that her use of physical force had set a dangerous precedent, that she had acted without medical authorization and without consulting the charge nurse or hospital administration. The document was dense and clinical and absolutely lethal. She read it once. Didn't call a lawyer. Didn't contest it. Just signed the acknowledgement that she had received notice and placed it in a personnel file folder that sat on the desk in the break room, a desk nobody else would approach, because by noon the story had spread through the unit like contagion. Hannah Clarke had gotten herself suspended. Hannah Clarke was under investigation. Hannah Clarke was done. The suspension letter came at 11 a.m. Administrative leave pending investigation. Full cooperation required. The words were careful and institutional, but the message was a sledgehammer: don't come back. She changed out of her scrubs in the locker room alone, listening to the ventilators hum through the walls. Nobody came to say goodbye. Nobody acknowledged her leaving. She held her badge for a long moment, the weight of it suddenly foreign, then left it in her locker beside something else she kept there, a pair of worn combat boots, their laces still knotted tight, dust from Marja still visible in the seams if you looked close enough. She didn't look close. She just closed the locker and walked out through the employee entrance into August heat that felt like a fist closing around her chest. She drove for hours with no destination. Through South Houston, past refineries and strip malls and neighborhoods where grass didn't grow anymore. The radio stayed off. Her hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. By 4 p.m. she found herself on the road north, heading toward the veteran cemetery outside the city limits, where the grass was maintained by people who understood what it meant to honor the dead, where rows of identical white headstones caught the heat shimmer off the asphalt and turned it into something that looked like water but wasn't. The rain started at 4:22 p.m. Not a light shower, violent, sudden rain that hammered the windshield like ammunition, the kind of downpour that meant Texas summer thunderstorms moving in from the Gulf. Hannah parked near Section G and walked. Her shoes sank into wet grass. The rain plastered her scrub top to her chest and shoulders, and she didn't run, didn't seek shelter. Just walked until she found the stone she was looking for, Marcus Andrew Clarke, 1985 to 2021, beloved husband and warrior. The engraving below his name bore his unit designation and his rank, but she'd memorized those details so many times they'd worn grooves into her memory. She stood there for a long time without moving. Rain streamed down her face, mixing with tears she didn't remember starting. Her breath came shallow and fast, and for the first time in 17 years, since that moment in Marja when she'd realized what her hands could do, she let herself shatter. Just a little. Just enough to hurt. I tried, she whispered. I tried to disappear like you said, Marcus. I tried to be just a nurse. I tried to be invisible. I tried to forget Camp Dwyer, forget the cricothyrotomy, forget all of it. Her voice cracked, an actual crack, a fracture in the composure she'd welded together piece by piece. But I can't even do this right. I can't even hide properly. Some man with a knife, some drunk with a gun in his hand, and my hands just, they remember. They take over. And now everyone knows. Everyone's looking, and I can't, she pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes. I can't undo what I did. I can't undo what I am. The rain fell harder. Thunder rolled across the cemetery like distant artillery. She clutched the pair of combat boots she'd brought from her locker, the same boots that had crossed the Helmand River, that had stood in 3 different field hospitals, that had carried her through 19 hours of sustained fire and 17 surgeries and 1,000 decisions that still lived in her muscles. She held them like they were alive. Like they could answer her. But they were just leather and dust now, stripped of purpose, souvenirs of a woman she'd tried to bury. I don't know who I am anymore, she said to the headstone. I'm not the corpsman. I'm not the one you told to stop fighting, stop being a weapon, just be a wife for once. I'm not invisible the way I wanted to be. And now I'm not even a nurse because I can't stop being what you loved me for. I can't stop being dangerous. She looked down at the boots in her hands, rain streaming through the seams. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I can't do what you asked. The cemetery was empty except for the dead, and the rain, and a woman standing in a thunderstorm holding on to pieces of a life she'd tried to shed. A woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, how to accept condescension and isolation and systematic humiliation, how to disappear into scrubs and white noise and the rhythm of machines that breathed for people who couldn't breathe for themselves. A woman who'd learned that the only way to survive the nightmares was to become someone the nightmares didn't recognize. And all of it, every choice, every small death of her former self, had collapsed in 4 seconds of muscle memory and pure instinct. She didn't know that on the other side of the city, in Sacred Heart Hospital's staffing office, the charge nurse was already dialing her number. She didn't know that a man named Khalid Nossery was being transported by ambulance from a clinic in downtown Houston with acute respiratory distress, that his oxygen saturation was already dropping, that by Tuesday morning the hospital would be desperate enough to call back a nurse they'd just fired. She didn't know that recognition was waiting for her in a hospital bed, that identities buried for 3 years were about to be excavated by a dying man's gasping words in a language she'd nearly forgotten she understood. All she knew, standing in the rain at Marcus's grave with worn boots in her trembling hands, was that she had tried to escape being a weapon, and the world wouldn't let her. Tuesday morning hit Sacred Heart's emergency department like a defibrillator's shock. A 48-year-old Afghan national named Khalid Nossery came through the doors on a stretcher, his breathing shallow and panicked, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone into dark water. Acute respiratory distress. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of crisis that makes experienced nurses move faster. Hannah Clarke wasn't supposed to be there. She was on administrative leave, her locker still holding the combat boots she couldn't bring herself to take home, her name still on the suspension notice posted in the break room. But Sacred Heart had called her at 6:22 a.m. anyway. Staffing shortage. Crisis level. Come in. She'd said yes without hesitation. Now she moved through the trauma bay with the kind of efficiency that made newer nurses stop and stare. No questions. No delay. The attending, Dr. Reeves, was still pulling up the chest X-ray when Hannah had already assessed the breath sounds, absent on the right side, and knew exactly what needed to happen. The 4 was already running. The needle was already in her hands. Khalid's chest wall rose and fell in irregular spasms. His lips had gone pale. His eyes were the color of burnished copper, wide and terrified. Hannah positioned the 14-gauge angiocath needle at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from 19 hours of holding a field hospital together while artillery rounds walked across the perimeter 3 years and 11 months ago. She didn't hesitate. Muscle memory took over. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that unmistakable sound of pressure equalizing, of lungs re-expanding, filled the trauma bay like relief itself taking physical form. O2 saturation began climbing. 68, 75, 82, 88. Khalid's breathing deepened. His panic began to release. But his eyes were locked on Hannah's face, and something was happening behind them. Recognition. Not the kind that came from seeing a nurse's face twice. The kind that came from seeing someone in a completely different uniform, in a completely different lifetime, in a place where death had a geography and a price. His mouth moved. The words came in Pashto, rapid and breathless, a language Hannah had trained herself not to speak, not to hear, not to remember. The angel of Marja, he gasped. You killed Rashid Dostum when he executed the village elder's son. I was there. I saw you. The room went still. Hannah's hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. But her breathing changed, one measured inhale, one measured exhale, and her eyes met his for exactly 1 second longer than professional. A woman's voice came from the doorway, sharp, accented, uncertain. Papa, what are you saying? Khalid's daughter Amina stood there, a translator badge around her neck, her dark eyes moving between her father and the small blonde woman in scrubs who had just saved his life. Amina had worked at Sacred Heart for 2 years. She'd never connected the dots. Until now. Khalid grabbed Hannah's wrist with surprising strength. His voice dropped lower, more controlled, the panic giving way to something else. Something like awe. You held the field hospital. You performed a cricothyrotomy on my nephew with supplies that shouldn't have worked. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Your rank. I remember your rank. Amina's face went pale. Not surprise. Recognition of something much larger being recognized. Hannah turned to the chart without responding and began documenting the procedure with clinical precision. Blood pressure stabilizing. Oxygen saturation 94%. Breath sounds restored bilaterally. The kind of information that hospitals needed, that kept people alive, that said everything except what Khalid's words were now saying to the entire room. Amina moved closer to her father, her voice dropping. You knew her? From Afghanistan. Knew of her, Khalid said, his eyes never leaving Hannah's profile as she worked. We all knew. The Americans did not send their best soldiers to save us. They sent their legends. They sent her. Hannah was already reaching for Khalid's asylum file, a habit when a patient came in with a story that mattered. And there it was, in the documentation. Navy SEAL operation, classified. Afghan allies extraction. Marja offensive, March 2010. The file didn't name her, but it named everything she'd done. The dates. The location. The designation, medical personnel, combat zone. She was reading the words when Commander William Price walked into the trauma bay wearing dress blues that fit him like authority itself. He was tall in the way that soldiers who'd spent 20 years in the field grew tall, not from genetics but from the weight of responsibility they'd carried and refused to set down. His eyes found Hannah's in the crowded room the way a sniper finds a target. Not with hostility. With recognition. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke," he said. His voice was quiet, but the room heard it anyway. "I was wondering if we'd ever cross paths again." Hannah set down the file. Her voice, when it came, was steady and level. "Commander Price. I didn't know you were in Houston." "I'm not. I was at Lackland, demobilizing a training cadre." He stepped forward and extended his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, brief, the kind of handshake that said, "We know what we've done together." "But I heard there was a nurse at Sacred Heart who knew how to handle a pneumothorax in field conditions. Thought I'd check it out. Didn't expect it to actually be you." The silence stretched. Amina was watching her father, watching the commander, watching the small blonde woman who'd just become someone completely different. Commander Price's voice shifted into something more formal. "Your record, Senior Chief Clarke, is decorated in ways most people never know about. Silver Star for Valor." He paused, letting that sit. 1 medal. 1 beat. 2 Bronze Stars. Another breath. Another moment for the weight to register. And a Navy Cross for the Marja offensive, where you held a field hospital under fire for 19 hours with 2 wounded and only 1 working ventilator. Hannah's hands were steady. But something in her chest had shifted, like plates in the earth moving after years of pressure. 19 hours. She remembered them as a single moment that had somehow lasted forever. Khalid was crying now, silent tears moving down his weathered face. "You saved my son," he whispered in English. He was 6 years old. His mother had died. You performed surgery on him with shells falling. He is 24 now. He lives in Dallas. He studies mechanical engineering. An FBI liaison entered the trauma bay, a woman with credentials and a measured expression. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Clarke, I'm Agent Sarah Yates. I oversee classified operations liaison with civilian institutions. I need you to understand what just happened here in medical terms. You performed an emergency procedure. In legal terms, you were part of a classified operation protecting Afghan allies. Your involvement in the Marja extraction was registered at the highest levels. What Dr. Sterling attempted to do, to challenge your credentials and your judgment, he was challenging someone with active top-secret clearance and a silver star." She pulled up something on her phone. Sacred Heart's IT director, Marcus Chen, a Marine Corps veteran, brought me security footage from Sunday night. The takedown in room 308 took for seconds. The technique you used requires military training at the operator level. Dr. Sterling recognized that immediately. Dr. Sterling was standing in the corner of the trauma bay, his face the color of antiseptic. His mouth was moving silently. His carefully constructed world, the authority he'd rebuilt, the hierarchy he'd established, the invisible nurse he'd targeted for humiliation, had just been reclassified as a matter of national security. He had attempted to destroy someone he'd never actually seen. Hannah looked at him across the trauma bay. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Just with the clear, steady gaze of someone who'd held the line longer than he'd held a job. "You should go," she said. 8 words. Gentle. Final. Dr. Sterling left. Commander Price was still watching her. "There's a SEAL reunion in 2 weeks. We'd like you to speak." No pressure. But these men, the ones who came through Marja, they talk about the Angel of Marja the way we talk about urban legends. It would mean something if they knew you were real. Hannah looked at Khalid, at his daughter Amina, who was understanding for the first time why her father had survived, why he was alive to have grandchildren, why his son was studying engineering in Dallas instead of being buried in the mountains that had nearly killed him. She thought about Marcus's grave. About combat boots in a locker. About 3 years of trying to disappear into the sound of beeping monitors and the rhythm of vital signs. "I'll speak," Hannah said. "Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it."